try to help our students get over the obstacle of what do you do when you're facing a blank page or a blinking cursor on the screen and you've got to start drafting legislation. It's a learned skill. You have to get there. You don't necessarily encounter it in your law school training beforehand. Law students know how to write memoranda that evaluate the law on the one hand, and on the other hand, they definitely know how to write briefs that take an advocacy position. Some of them have learned how to write a good letter, and that's a helpful thing, or a memo to the file, but very few have had occasion to draft legislation. So one of the bits of wisdom that we give our students is one that we got some years ago from Bob Martineau, whose little book, Drafting Legislation and Rules in Plain English, was a very useful text to us when we first started teaching legislative advocacy. Martineau's wisdom follows the formulation SAP, which of course means fool in our slang, but what it stands for in Martineau's formulation is actually a very wise piece of advice, and that is singular. Draft in the singular. When you are drafting legislation or agency regulations, if you regulate the one, you will regulate the many. Draft in the singular. What else goes into the voice of legislation or agency regulations? Active voice. If you draft in the active voice, you will more often than not help the reader identify who is the actor. It's very important in drafting legislation and agency regulations to know who is accountable for taking action. And then finally, and this one is a tough one, P for present tense. You know, you're drafting legislation today that might get introduced to the legislature some months from now, and maybe if all goes well will pass, and if the governor signs it, it might become law a year from now. So the instinct is to draft in future terms, and that's a bad instinct, and you want to fight it. When I drive through the red light, I am violating the law right then and there, in the present. So if you want to capture the voice of legislation, follow Martineau's wisdom with the SAP formulation, draft in the singular, use the active voice, and draft in the present tense. You know, our students probably have in their minds, whether they articulate it or not, the same question that I had in my mind and did articulate quite some time ago when I worked as an intern on Capitol Hill, and I was supposed to draft a piece of legislation for the congressman. And it was to be a code of ethics. And I had no idea where to begin. I stared at the page for quite a little while, and then finally I went and I asked the congressman's chief of staff, who was a former newspaperman. I said, Dick, you know, I'm having trouble getting started on this project. What do you recommend? He said, well, I recommend using the newspaperman's questions. Who, what, when, where, how many? That was his background. But it's also good advice for legislative drafters, because if you're having trouble getting started, asking that series of journalists' questions will take it down from a level of abstraction and give it a more concrete flavor. Put people in the picture. Richard Wydick, whose wonderful little text, Plain English for Lawyers, is the volume that we use in our legislative and administrative advocacy class, says, put people in the picture. Without people, there would be no legal problems. So think in terms of people, and the words that were suddenly so hard to capture will begin to take shape on the page.